So our guests today are Mark Zivin and Aviv Tatarsky. Both Mark and Aviv have been deeply involved in the effort to prevent the demolition of 38 homes in the Palestinian village of Al-Walaja in East Jerusalem. Mark has been doing the work here in the United States, leading a real grassroots advocacy effort, and Aviv obviously in Jerusalem with Ir Amim. He is a researcher, senior researcher at Ir Amim. Mark, before introducing and turning over to Aviv, would you mind maybe talking just briefly about how you became involved in this effort and what you've done here in the United States on this issue?
Happy to do that. So I would have to say that fate and the Sumka family brought me to Al-Walaja. And let me explain that. So my first visit to the West Bank was in 2010 with my family, and it was led by Ilana Sumka. And Ilana at that time was a young woman who was running an NGO there, their office there called Encounter. And what Encounter does is it brings folks from the US and also people from Israel, some conservatives really, and people on the other side, hopefully to expose them to the West Bank. You take them on tours to the West Bank to meet Palestinians and to see the situation there. So as part of that tour, we went to Bethlehem, and part of that tour, she said, let's take a ride out to the village of Al-Walaja, where they're actually building the separation barrier around the village to basically exclude it from Jerusalem, even though it's part of Jerusalem. And on the way there, we were stopped by a pretty tough Israeli border police sergeant, and it was a memorable experience, and I won't go into it now. But fast forward to last December, when Ilana's father, Howard Sumka, who's a former mission director for USAID in the area, he posted a note about a webinar that was going to happen in early December about demolitions in Al-Walaja. And it clicked in my mind, you know, that I'd been there and I remembered the village and I was interested. So this was put together by three folks, other folks that turned out as part of the committee from Minneapolis, basically, Dave Snyder, John Ornstein, and Annie Cantor Ben Hillel, who's actually now living in Jerusalem, but was originally from Minneapolis. And this webinar explained the situation. 38 homes were facing demolition, and there was a Supreme Court ruling that was going to be coming up on December 26th. And they were working on a letter from American Jewish clergy and leaders to go to Lapid. And so I assisted with that. We ended up with 237 signatures and a Washington Post op-ed by Gershom Gorenberg, which was pretty effective. However, then the hearing got delayed till March 30th. And it kind of fell off my radar at that point. But then the folks from Minneapolis put together a series of 3 webinars on housing policies and demolitions in Jerusalem. That began in late January, and I got kicked in again. I contacted Howard. We got together with those folks. We brought in Ben Linder, who is on the J Street board. He's on the board of the American Friends of Combatants for Peace and also works with the South Hebron Hills Watch. And we began planning. And I'll make this short, but I'm happy to discuss it further if folks are interested. But from there, we were able to get Jan Schakowsky to sponsor a letter to Blinken. That was step 1. She and her staff began working on things, but things really ramped up when Howard and I put in a call to Hadar Suskind of APN. And that's when we got Madeline and Hadar working together really with folks on the Hill to put this letter together and get it across the line. And the letter was finalized, wasn't finalized till March 11th. There was quite a lot of because we were approaching the March 30th date, there was a lot of trepidation about this, but finally it got finalized, and we had 1 week to get signatures on it. And I'm very proud to say that through a lot of hard work for everybody involved and a lot of connections, we were able to get 50 signatures, which is a really, I think, an impressive amount. That letter went to Blinken on March 18th. And from all appearances, it actually was effective. What we hear is that Blinken brought up the issue of demolitions. I don't know exactly if Al-Walaja was mentioned there, but clearly it was on his mind, and he was getting pressure for this in the meeting that he had with Foreign Minister Lapid. So again, I'm happy to answer further questions, and now I'll turn it over to Aviv. Now, Aviv, as Ori said, is a researcher with the Israeli NGO Iramim, and he has a deep knowledge of the Israeli policies on East Jerusalem and the way they affect the Palestinian communities. He writes in the areas of settlement construction, police violence, temple movements, planning and building, and grassroots resistance. And I would have to say he was key to, on our end, to making sure that what we were communicating to people in Congress and to the public was factual. There were a lot of pushback questions on these things, and every time we asked questions, when we needed to get the details, because one of the things that we wanted to make sure was that we could combat any of the disinformation or misinformation that was coming from the other side, and that we weren't putting members of Congress in a position where they were saying something that wasn't true. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aviv. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And of course, Ori and Madeleine for organizing this. I'm Aviv, very happy to speak with you. And I'll start on a personal note, because actually my first time in Walaja, the way I got to Walaja is also through Ilana Sumka. So, and every once in a while, I remember, you know, for me, the connection with Walaja is something very, very precious that has a lot of meaning for me. So I wasn't aware, Mark, that you got to Walaja with Ilana as well. So another circle here is coming together. Actually, I came to Walaja with Ilana as a grassroots activist. I wasn't working in Iramim then. I was doing very different things. And as my activism became, you know, I got deeper into activism, I also chose to work for Iramim. So Walaja is very, very significant for me in many, many ways. But since it's not about me, I'll try to share the screen for a small presentation on Walaja. Sorry, yeah. Okay, can you see it? Yeah. Okay, so let's go. Like, where is Walaja? What is Walaja? This is a, you know, a map. You see in the north, you see Jerusalem. Should be written here somewhere. I don't see it, but Jerusalem is up here. And Bethlehem is here, just to the south of Jerusalem. And Al-Walaja is, you know, just between the two. The broken line that you can see right next to Walaja is the green line, the border between Israel and what used to be under Jordanian control, but between Israel and the West Bank. And actually, the blue circle that I put to mark Al-Walaja, it's also on the Israeli side of the green line. So actually, Al-Walaja was on a very big area before 1948. And the green line, the border was determined through Al-Walaja lands. Actually, the original village, you know, centuries-old village, was on the Israeli side of the border. So actually, Walaja residents were uprooted, became refugees in 1948. And the Walaja of today, built on lands that were left on the Jordanian side of the border, you can call it like new Al-Walaja. So it's some of the refugees building new homes for themselves, rebuilding the village, 1948 and onwards. If we fast forward to 1960, sorry, before we fast forward to 1967, a few words about Walaja, and usually we speak naturally about, you know, the concerns, the issues, the discrimination. But Walaja, because maybe I'll go up for a second, because it's at the outskirts of Jerusalem, and it was annexed, or parts of it were annexed in 1967. I'll show it in a second, but it's really at the edge of Jerusalem today. So for many years, they were more or less, you know, it's not accurate to say, but more or less left on their own. Like there were arrests, there were home demolitions, there was expropriation of land, but in many other manners, Walaja, many huge changes that happened in the other Palestinian parts that were annexed to Jerusalem after 1967 didn't happen in Walaja, and therefore Walaja remains or is able to keep a lot of its agricultural way of life and heritage. So this is just like a small example. There's a few more. That's an example of the amazing olive terraces of Walaja. And one last slide, if I think, from another direction. And hopefully you can see up in the top, you can see the homes or some of the homes of Walaja, like peeping here in the top, very, very close to the olive terraces. And why am I, taking time to speak about this? Because one, Walaja is an amazingly beautiful place, and it's really important for me to say it before we go into the threats and the crisis that the community is dealing with. It's an amazingly beautiful place. It's beautiful thanks to nature, but also very much thanks to the agriculture and to the way of life that's been going on for centuries, and that's being preserved by the Walaja community even today when, be it urbanization, modernization, and the occupation. There are many reasons or many things that cause this way of life to disappear. Walaja is able to maintain it. And an important part of it is the community living right next to its lands or even inside its lands. So that's where you see it a little bit here with the homes in between the terraces. And I'll get back to the agricultural heritage of Al-Walaja. But now going back to the geopolitics. So this is an ERME map, and with all the colors, all the lines that we can speak an hour just about them, it's an expression of how complicated the situation is. But Walaja, here it is, again circled with a blue circle. As I said, it's at the edge of the annexed territory. So you see the green line. Walaja is on the green line. The blue line is the line of annexation, what Israel annexed in 1967. And Walaja is right at the edge, and you can even see, I'm not sure I can, oops, sorry. I don't think I can zoom in, but hopefully you can see it. The blue line, the annexation line, runs through Al-Walaja. So the northern part here was annexed to East Jerusalem. So today, formally speaking, it's a neighborhood of Jerusalem under the Jerusalem municipality, under the Ministry of Interior. The Israeli law pertains there. Whereas the southern part, which is right adjacent to it, sorry, my mouse here. The southern part, it's not two parts, it's one village. But Israel drew a line through the village, and what's south of the line was not annexed. So considered by Israel today to be the West Bank, not part of Jerusalem, authority of the Israeli army. And the Oslo Accords dividing or taking parts of the West Bank, areas A, B, and C, it's mostly area C, where Israel has the authority, the Palestinian Authority does not have authority, okay? And so since 1967, the community has been, in terms of law, in terms of privileges or rights and I don't know, all kinds of limitations of the occupation, has been split in this way. For the implications for what we want to speak about tonight is that we are focusing on the northern part of Walaja, the part annexed to Jerusalem, where, since the Israeli law holds, also the Israeli planning and building law holds, okay? And that will bring us to the issue of home demolitions, but just a little bit before that, the map we see here is a same map of the Jerusalem, but also the surroundings. And the pale blue patches are the areas around Jerusalem that were to be annexed to Israel as part of the Trump plan. 2 years ago published, the Abraham Accords and the Trump so-called deal of the century, that Israel was to annex a huge part of the West Bank. These are the parts around Jerusalem to be annexed. It's not something that Trump thought of by himself, or that's something new that had to do with the Trump administration. These have been Israeli plans for what the Israeli governments have called Greater Jerusalem. So annexing settlements in the vicinity of Jerusalem, annexing them and making them part of Jerusalem. And if we consider this blue patch here in the south, you see, for example, how it surrounds Bethlehem. Okay, there's a lot to say about that, but since we're focusing on Walaja, it basically swallows up Al-Walaja. Okay.
And if you don't mind, just a quick clarification question while we are looking at the map. My
Sure.
understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, that although Al-Walaja is split between East Jerusalem and the West Bank, the contour of the barrier excludes all of Walaja from East Jerusalem. Is that correct?
That's 100% correct. It's difficult to see, but the red line over there is the separation barrier that Ori mentioned. And in the next slide, we'll be able to see it better. And it's just, you just brought me to what needs to be said. The Trump plan, of course, did not happen. Probably no one is gonna really come back to it, thank God. The annexation didn't happen, but on the ground, Israel has the abilities to do all kinds of things that we can call them unilateral steps on the ground that are leading to the vision of annexation. If we want, we can call them de facto annexation. So the formal annexation didn't take place, but things on the ground are happening. There is no status quo. It's not a situation staying as it is. And Walaja gives us an example, and I'm going to describe, 3-4 things that if we just speak about them, we could say, okay, it's a misfortune for Walaja, it's an injustice, but taking into account that there is a plan of annexation, it also shows us the motivation, the logic, the vision behind it. So Ori mentioned the separation barrier. I hope it's better to see you. It's easier to see now. It's the red line here. And just as Ori said, the part between the barrier and the blue line is the annexation line. So that's, formally speaking, Jerusalem. That's the Jerusalem part of Walaja. The separation barrier was constructed in a way that disconnects it from Jerusalem, separates it from Jerusalem. If we wanted to argue against it, if we wanted to say that that's, not right, it should have been done differently, we should offer, either we say we don't want the separation barrier at all, or offer a different route. We can see that in Walaja, it's very difficult to offer a different route, because if the route went on the annexation border, it would split the community in two. If it went south of Walaja, it would disconnect it from Bethlehem. Okay, so any which way, the Walaja residents would pay a big price for the separation barrier, but the Walaja community did have a preference. I mean, the preference was that the barrier not be built, but if it is built, they said, build it on the green line. Okay, if they told Israel, if Israel needs to separate the West Bank from Israel for whatever reasons, Israel says for security, then the barrier should go on the green line, and that way Israel will have its security, and Walaja would not be would be less affected. That did not happen. You can see on the right-hand side, on the eastern flank of Walaja, how close the barrier comes up to the built-up area. The brown patch is the built-up area, okay? And it goes around Walaja, you see, from the south, on the east, to the north, and just the western part is open. So Walaja is almost like circled by the barrier. What more, the green patch that you see to the north of Walaja, that's Al-Walaja lands between the village and the green line. that's Al-Walaja lands that the barrier disconnected. So basically, the village lost them. Some of the pictures that I showed you with the olive terraces are located there. It's a huge area, 1,200 dunams. I don't think dunams is what is not in the system in the US, but that's what I know to say. It's a very big area of agricultural lands that were lost for the village. And in parallel to the construction of the barrier, the Israeli government turned them into a national park, okay, that's supposed to serve Israelis, West Jerusalemites like myself, that want to go and we want to enjoy ourselves in nature. That's how it is today. So the barrier and the national park together, they isolate, almost completely isolate Walaja. This red patch here is a plan for a new settlement being advanced in the last couple of years, okay, by the name of Har Gilo West. So Har Gilo is right here to the south of Walaja, the blue patch. The settlement has been there for 50 years, a little bit more, okay? And now Israel says it's going to extend it. In my eyes, the red patch is actually a new settlement. It's not an extension, but for Walaja, it means completely, sealing it off and disconnecting it from its area and so on. Gladly, together with Walaja residents, we have been able so far, I don't know how long it will last, to stop the process of approving this settlement. We have brought up serious objections that are the political objections. Of course, it's very easy for the government to disregard them, but we have also brought some serious arguments that have to do with geology and hydrology and nature and so on. And Israel hoped to approve the settlement last year, and it's so far has been stopped. Okay. I hope I can go back to this positive note, but now we come to the issue of Walaja. So if Israel is working in this way to isolate Walaja, what is the future for the village itself? And since 2016, the Jerusalem part of Walaja has been hit very, very hard by home demolitions. Sorry, this is how the village looks surrounded by the separation barrier. So you see the village, you see the barrier around it, and below the barrier, it's those agricultural lands that I mentioned. You can, I think, notice that it's terraced. And again, on the one hand, the beautiful area, on the other hand, taken away from the farmers and from the families who make a living of it. So in the last 6 years, Walaja has been hit by home demolitions. When I mean hit by home demolitions, we're speaking in the Jerusalem part. Walaja is not a huge village. There's 3,000 people living in Al-Walaja, just over 1,000 of them in the part next to Jerusalem, roughly 150 homes in the Jerusalem part of Walaja. Since 2016, 80 demolition orders have been distributed there. So we're speaking of more than half the homes. 30 or more of these have been executed. So in the last 6 years, 30 families have in the village have lost their homes. And the remaining 50 are lingering. Like there's a lot, there's court appeals that are delaying them, and we'll speak about the big court appeal that's coming up in court tomorrow. But what is going on? What is taking place? So, planning and building law, the Israeli law holds in the Jerusalem part of Walaja because of the annexation. It includes the planning and building law, which says something quite logical. It says, if you want to build a home, you need to get a building permit. That can make sense. Building permit is being issued by the Jerusalem municipality because this is part of Jerusalem city because of the annexation. But the municipality issues building permits based on a zoning plan. a zoning plan which determines where you can build, where you cannot build, what can you build, how much can you build, and so on. So for example, if I were to own land and the zoning plan would say that this land needs to be a road, this land needs to be a school, this land needs to be a park, I would not be able to get a building permit from the municipality. And it happens, of course. But when it happens, there are all kinds of ways of not leaving me homeless, offering me a solution. In Walaja, since 1967, the state has never made a zoning plan. And when residents initiated a zoning plan 15 years ago, the state refused to approve it. So the meaning is we have a neighborhood in Jerusalem, in the capital of Israel, with no zoning plan, meaning no one can get a building permit. And of course, and I should stress, Walaja was there in 1967. It was there before 1967. The annexed area already had a built-up area where it wasn't a big community, but where part of the Walaja community were living. And naturally, people, they get married, they have children, new families, and so on. You need more building, you need new buildings, and no one can get building permits. People have two choices. One is obey the law, which of course for Palestinians is the law of occupation. But regardless of whatever we call it, it's a law that denies them the ability to get a building permit. So obeying the law means go and find a home elsewhere in Bethlehem, okay? Meaning Israel, the law assists Israel, or the law that Israel made assists it to push Palestinians out of Jerusalem. The other possibility is for people to say, we want to stay and live next to our community, okay? So I have no choice. I will build, my family owns land, I will build a home for myself. And it's without a permit. People have done this since 1967. Of course, many dozens of homes were built without a permit, and homes were demolished because of that. But it happened every once in a while. It's very bad, it's terrible when a family loses its home, but it was happening at a rate that was not threatening the existence of the community. In 2016, Israel changed the planning and building law and also added extra budgets, you can say, for demolition of homes. And all of this was done specifically targeting Palestinian communities in Israel, not in the West Bank. It's a law that has to do with the state of Israel. Walaja is annexed to Israel, so the law holds there. And then the combination with very aggressive enforcement, very aggressive punishment for lack of permits, and the fact that there is no zoning plan, together this created a terrible threat on the existence of Walaja. I already gave you the numbers. Currently, and now I'll come to the Supreme Court hearing tomorrow, and you will tell me, Mark, if I should stop or continue, but with the time. But the people who get demolition orders, they can appeal against them to the court. So families, if they didn't do that, their homes got demolished within 24 hours. If they did appeal to the court, then the judge would review the situation. Sometimes they would even say it's a big injustice, the fact that there is no zoning plan for Walaja, but the judge would say, I have to determine whether there is a building permit or there is no building permit, and so on, and they would approve the demolition, and that's the way that 30 homes were demolished in the last 6 years. So having no other choice, or the last resort was for the Walaja community to appeal the fact that they are being denied a zoning plan. And that's what the community did in 2017. And that petition appeal so far has frozen the execution of 38 demolition orders. There are other demolition orders who unfortunately are not frozen by that appeal, but 38 homes so far in the last few years have been protected. With the demand or the claim, we want fair planning. We want our rights for a zoning plan. The problem is that the court cannot force the state to make a zoning plan. Okay, the way the Israeli system works, it's not a matter for the court. The court can ask or can suggest or can and so on. So what the court did, the court said, look, we know that Walaja initiated a master plan, a zoning plan of their own, and the planning committees, the Jerusalem District Planning Committee, refused to even review it. That's not according to the law. So the court was able to force the District Planning Committee to review the plan. So the committee reviewed the plan and they simply rejected it. That took place last year. Now the issue is coming back to the court, which will need to determine whether to do as the state has requested, reject the appeal, and therefore, one, allow the execution of those 38 home demolitions, and two, really make it very, very difficult to get a zoning plan approved. Or maybe the court will decide, and that's what we're hoping for, that the freeze of the demolition orders should continue and tell the state that it expects it to find a solution, which will be a very, putting the responsibility on the state to solve this issue by means of a zoning plan. That's the right thing in our eyes. That's what we have been working for, and that's what we're very much hoping will happen tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Aviv. That was really phenomenal and in-depth. Before we get into some of the questions, I did want to ask a clarifying question just for everyone's sake. You know, here we talk about East Jerusalem. We really do think east of Jerusalem, right? East of the Green Line. And really Al-Walaja, as everyone saw on the map, is, southwest of the heart of Jerusalem, but of course over the Green Line. Would you mind just clarifying why it is that we call it that, exactly, helping us all kind of reorient ourselves from the geographic explanation to the geopolitical?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. So I'll bring back the map. And just as you said, here Walaja is on the south, on the western part. And you see all so-called East Jerusalem, the annexed territory, some of it is in the north, some of it is in the east, and some of it is in the south. So this is the line of annex. This is the area that Israel chose to annex. And it's very interesting, why and so on. There maybe the two things that are most relevant for us this evening. One is, you see the Green Line. The Green Line is the border between Israel and Jordan until 1967, and Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, the capital, is here right on the border and borders on all sides, okay? So if you think geopolitically, if you think militarily, for Israel, it's not a good situation that its capital is right on the border. So the idea was to expand borders of Jerusalem on all directions, okay? Militarily, strategically, it was seen as something important. There are, and a lot of the Israeli analysis or Israeli governments looking at the situation of occupation on the one hand, and maybe a prospect of two states sometime in the future on the other hand, has to do with these issues of Israeli security or strategy or whatever. Thing is that these considerations don't take into consideration at all the Palestinian population. And, drawing a line, just an arbitrary line here, it was one space until 1967, with lots of interconnections between the so-called West Bank and the so-called East Jerusalem. These were not two separate entities. And once Israel annexes just part of it, and decades later really separates them physically with a separation barrier, it causes extreme problems for millions of Palestinians. In Walaja, it's really extreme with the annexation cutting through the village. The other very relevant thing is that maybe the main, I don't know, yardstick to how to draw this line of annexation was wanting to get a big area, to annex a big area, but with not a big Palestinian population. That's why Bethlehem was not annexed, okay? That's why Ramallah was not annexed, and so on. So this, in a one-liner, we sometimes call it maximum area, minimum number of Palestinians. And unfortunately, with this frame of mind, it also leads to discrimination in planning and to home demolitions. So something that, Jewish majority in Jerusalem, many Israelis take it for granted that it's required, it comes at the expense of the most basic human rights of Palestinians.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask another quick question before moving on, but I wanted to get into a little bit about the master plan process, because I think what makes this situation unique, while it is of course related to the master plan, is that we don't see, unlike a lot of the other efforts to change the demographics in Jerusalem, we don't see like conflicting claims on the land itself. But instead, it's really just an unjust system set up to deny Palestinians the ability to build. But can you talk a bit about that process, since it's not as cut and dry, at least from like an American perspective?
Sure. Yeah, it's a whole thing. I'll probably say it more simple than it is. But naturally, if there is a neighborhood, then it needs a zoning plan or a master plan. And it would be the responsibility of state authorities to make one. Very naturally, the Jerusalem municipality or the Ministry of Construction or the Ministry of Interior, those are the bodies that usually initiate master plans, whether in Israel, in Jerusalem, or in other cities in Israel. And I'm sure all of you that are listening here, I never had to make a master plan for my neighborhood. Okay, maybe if I had the luck to own some piece of private land, maybe I would make a master plan for my small, dunam, 2 dunams, in order to build there whatever I want to build. But neighborhood, the state needs to do it. Sorry, yeah. Okay, I'll continue. I thought you wanted to say something, but I'll continue. Okay. And Israel, of course, all the time makes master plans for Israeli parts of Jerusalem on both parts of the Green Line. In East Jerusalem, in the annexed areas, Israel until today constructed 55,000 housing units for Israelis in what we Israelis call neighborhoods of Jerusalem, but are actually settlements in the annexed area. It also made master plans for Palestinian neighborhoods, because if it would have not, no Palestinian could have gotten a building permit in Silwan, in Jabal el-Mukaber, in Sheikh Jarrah, in wherever. And there are many problems with these master plans, because they were designed, again, with this Israeli concern of Palestinian demographics. So they were devised in a way that aims to control the size of the Palestinian population, not really supply the needed housing units, with the idea that if people cannot get building permits, some of them will be forced to leave. In Jerusalem, in Walaja, this was brought to an extreme. As I described, no master plan at all. And then It's also possible for residents, for communities to initiate master plans of their own. They have to prove that they own the land, otherwise they have no right to do it, but they can do it. The only thing, there are two buts. One, it's very, very, very complicated to do it. It's not something that people, you know, myself, you, whoever, really, we don't need to deal with those things. It's something for the state to do. It's very expensive, and it requires a lot of effort and a lot of thinking and so on. But communities, Palestinian communities who had no choice, they took it on, and also they received assistance from NGOs and so on. Same for Walaja, I mentioned it. The other but is at the end of the day, you can make whatever master plan you want. It's the Israeli authorities who decide whether or not to approve it. And since the planning system is so political, it's very easy for the state to block and to reject whatever master plan it's not happy with.
Thanks, Aviv. I want to relay a couple of questions that we have in the Q&A. So one question is, what happens to the people of Walaja whose homes have already been demolished? What happened to those? And how much agricultural land do the people of Walaja still control of their actual land? And then another question in that kind of basket is whether you see a way for the people of Walaja to reclaim their land. And I'll add one more question to that. If you would like, you can zoom out a little bit and talk about the overall, you know, you mentioned demographics. How does the question of dispossession of people in Walaja play into the overall campaign, if you believe that there is such a campaign, on the part of the Israeli authorities to dispossess Palestinians in East Jerusalem?
Right, thanks. Maybe I'll start with a zoom out, and then I'll go to the questions directly regarding Walaja. As early as 1967, you know, Israel was concerned with Palestinian demographics in Jerusalem. And when you read the minutes of government discussions as the war was taking place, the expectation was that just as in 1948, Palestinians fled areas where the Israeli forces took over, the same will happen in Jerusalem, or in the old city of Jerusalem and close to it. It did not happen. And in the first weeks after the war, I'm sorry to say this, but the Israeli government actually sent busloads of Palestinians. So somehow it forced East Jerusalemites to go on buses and go to Jordan. And it continued for a couple of weeks until the Jordanian government refused to allow it to continue. And then in the early 1970s, a government committee designed, you know, guidelines for a policy in Jerusalem. And one of the main guidelines was keep the demographics, keep the ratio to like 25%, 26% Palestinians, 74% Israelis, Israeli Jews. And that was, you know, that was a committee decision. It was adopted by the government. It wasn't secret. No one thought it's something to hide. It was taken for granted that, yeah, this is what needs to be done. Of course, the government in a democratic state, very difficult for it to control demographics of one ethnic group compared to another. It shouldn't do it at all, but if it tries to do it, how could it do it? And that's why the planning and building policy became such a major mechanism. On the one hand, expropriating huge areas in East Jerusalem. So 35% of the area of East Jerusalem was expropriated. It's Palestinian, it was Palestinian private land. And those 55,000 housing units that I mentioned, were built for Israelis in the neighborhoods or settlements that Israel created in Jerusalem. And that was one part. And the other part is what I already described, the master plans that don't really allow the needed construction for Palestinians. I'll give you one small example. Jabal el-Mukaber, not a small neighborhood in East Jerusalem, 60% or in the master plan that Israel made, 60% of the area is marked as green space, open space where you're not allowed to build at all. Or Silwan, right next to the old city, where a big part of the neighborhood was declared a national park. Some of it maybe with good reasons. There's a very important archaeological site there, which we call City of David, and it's extremely important, but at the expense of the neighborhood and of the needs of the community. If we look at recent years, it's like an analysis that I made a couple of years ago. Like the last time that Israeli authorities made a master plan for a Palestinian neighborhood was 20 years ago. And most of the Palestinian neighborhoods, their master plans are 30 and 40 years old. Nothing like that for the Israeli neighborhoods. A couple of years ago, housing units that were in master plans that were advanced in Jerusalem, Palestinian neighborhoods got 10% of the housing units. The population, the Palestinian population is 38%. So the gap 10% to 38 is huge. And, people, it's a real, that's probably the biggest problems for Palestinians in Jerusalem. Where can we get a home? How can we build a home with a permit? Or do we have to leave Jerusalem? Or do we have to take the risk that we build and our home will be demolished? The questions right on Walaja. So I think that roughly on the Palestinian side of the barrier, Jerusalem Walaja is something like 800 dunams. It's not small in itself, but in comparison to what Walaja used to have, it's less than half. And parts of it are built up, but there are big parts which are still the agricultural lands, the terraces, and where agriculture continues to take place. In comparison, the agricultural lands on the Israeli side of the barrier that the barrier took away, it's 1,200 dunams. So it's bigger than the area on the Palestinian side. And the agriculture there is continuing in, as I mentioned, in traditional ways. So no, it's without industry, it's without heavy machinery. It's the same, very similar to how it was, 100 years ago. The irrigation is based on springs and so on. It's quite amazing. As the prospects of regaining access to land. So this is an important point because I think we should not forget the possibilities, the positive potential there is as we speak of all the bad things that are happening. Naturally speaking, the barrier should have made it impossible for farmers to reach the lands. Something happened that the Israeli authorities stopped. They didn't extend the barrier, and it ends on one side of Walaja, okay? And therefore, physically speaking, it's possible for a farmer to bypass, go a very long way around the barrier and reach their land. Only it's very, very difficult. One, it's a long way to walk by foot because there's no road there. But two, once they're on the Israeli side, of course, the Israeli military soldiers can harass them, can arrest them, saying they're not supposed to be there, they're not allowed to be there. And since it was declared a national park, then there's also national park inspectors that can harass them. So we could really see how since 2010, farmers, the numbers really dropped of farmers accessing those areas, and only the most determined people, very few, continue to do so. And some of the Israeli activist support for Walaja was working with these farmers and protecting them and accompanying them and seeing all kinds of ways to support them. And the amazing thing is that in the last year and a half, we see a change. We see less harassment of the farmers, and with the support from the Israeli activists, farmers who stopped going there are coming back, and the areas that for a number of years were neglected are now again being cultivated in something beautiful and something very, satisfying and inspiring to see.
And Mark, before you go, just a clarification regarding the land measurements that Aviv mentioned. So 800 dunams is approximately 200 acres, and 1,200 dunams is approximately 300 acres. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Well, there's one quick question I have, I think, and then maybe a little longer question. The first, it came in from someone. Have there been any terrorists, Palestinian terrorists, from your knowledge, that have come from Walaja?
Right. There have been three, I don't know, it's not a good word, but well-known incidents of Israelis murdered in the vicinity of Walaja. The most recent one, it's over from 50. The 80s. Yeah, in the 80s and in the 90s. The most recent one, quite horrible, is of a young woman. She was aged 18, 19, who was raped and murdered by a Palestinian 2 years ago. These all three incidents of murder, it had nothing to do with Walaja residents. Okay, it was Palestinians coming from other places. It's not that all Walaja residents love Israel. It's not that all of them, hold by non-violence. But since the question was asked, Walaja residents, as far as I know, have not been involved in such acts, such actions. It's a very peaceful community, I must say. I've been visiting it regularly. I mentioned that, like Mark, I arrived there in 2010. I've been visiting it regularly for more than a decade. There was one time after a resident was killed by the Israeli army. There was one time that I was told to leave, that his family said, we're not willing that you be here. But other than, and that too was nonviolent. Other than that, I never experienced, any unpleasant thing.
Well, I would say that when I open the paper here in Chicago, I hear about 10 times that much every day, I'm sorry to say. So, we have our own violence problems here. But more importantly, what I'm taking away from this is a couple things, and some of the questions really have to do with, we do see this as kind of a part of a system, right? A part of let's not call it a master plan, but let's call it a master plan for a shortcut, right? And it seems to me, I have a question coming from an advocacy point of view as an American. It seems to me, so we did what we can do on this, and I think successfully, to get a letter to Congress, to Blinken. But it seems to me, I'm getting the sense that we have to come up with some new strategies, possibly, to deal with trying to directly put pressure, and I don't know how to do this. I'm just saying my conclusion is put directly some pressure on the authorities in Israel itself, the planning commissions, and somehow expose them in a way that kind of at least embarrasses them about what's going on now and publicizes how this all works. I'm throwing that out there to you if you have any other ideas, because we do have people on this call that are interested in this issues. And we've been focused on March 30th, us here on this end, but it's clear that from what you've said that the best of what's going to happen is going to be to stop those immediate demolitions. But then the bigger issue remains. It's the Supreme Court, from what you said, cannot solve this problem. It's going to go back to somebody, and we're going to have to then pick up this issue to put pressure to get the planning, to get permits, and to make sure that these things can happen, and municipal services for that matter.
Right. So actually, you're bringing us, if we're close to the end of time, you're bringing us to the most important issue. I completely agree with what you said. And I think that in many instances, for example, Khan al-Ahmar, which was a big issue, Sheikh Jarrah, usually the best that we hope for is let's make enough pressure on the Israeli government so the demolitions don't take place, so the evictions don't take place. In Walaja, when we said we have to work with the community against the demolitions, we decided to be much more ambitious. And we decided that we don't want just to stop the demolitions, because that by nature would be temporary. We want a master plan that would take off the threat. Okay, and that's something much more difficult and much more ambitious. And for that, we need exactly what you said. And for that reason, we have been working, I think, in a different way than usual on these issues. And we said Walaja is such a unique place that we will be able to gain support from within the Israeli ministries, the Israeli planning establishment, the Israeli planning committees. And the residents of Walaja were amazing in their the way they agreed to have trust and to be willing to speak to Israeli officials. And we created like a group of West Jerusalem residents that have, friendly relationships with Walaja residents. Annie, that was mentioned here, is one of them, and there are others. And we started using our contacts to bring, at first, just professional people from the fields of planning and conservation and nature to Al-Walaja to hear the story, and everyone who heard what you have just heard, but also saw the situation on the ground. And I must say again, saw how beautiful it is and saw the wonderful agriculture. Many of them really, joined us. And then through them, it was possible to reach officials in the planning committees and so on. And we have, over the last year and a half, we built support, reaching, of course, the Knesset also and some of the ministries. The recent contributions, the letter of the rabbis that you mentioned, and more recently, the Congress letter was, of course, an amazing contribution, and we felt the impact of it. And together, we hope that so far, we feel that we are in a much better situation than Walaja was a year ago, still not enough. But we see that this strategy really has chances to succeed.
Thank you, Aviv, and thank you, Mark. I think, unfortunately, we've reached the end of this discussion. We always end, and there's a lot of questions still to be asked and a lot of things to be said. There is quite a bit of information about Walaja on Ir Amin's website, so you can seek it out there. I put in a link earlier in the chat, but you could just Google Ir Amin and you'll find it. Tomorrow is the discussion at the Israeli Supreme Court. We are, crossing our fingers, hoping that there'll be good results. And this brings us to the end of our webinar. One more quick comment, and we had a question about it in the Q&A earlier. So yes, there will be the recording of this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel video version and on our podcast audio version. And with that, thank you, Aviv. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Madeline. And thanks to everyone who joined us for this webinar.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks. Bye now, everyone.